It was a quiet evening, the kind that made the streets look peaceful and sleepy. The sun had gone down an hour ago, leaving behind a soft orange line on the horizon. A man named Daniel Reed was driving home after a long business trip. His car, a silver sedan, rolled smoothly down a nearly empty highway. He had been on the road for hours and was counting down the miles to his house, where a warm shower and a proper meal were waiting. Daniel wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed attention. He was calm, thoughtful, and always liked to keep to himself. He worked as a systems analyst for a defense contractor, the kind of job that didn't sound exciting to most people, but carried a lot of responsibility. He had spent the day in meetings with government officials in another city, going over projects that were confidential. Nothing about his day had been out of the ordinary. The only mistake Daniel made that evening was taking a wrong exit. He had missed his usual route and ended up driving through a quiet suburban town he had never seen before. The streets were empty, and the only sound came from the soft hum of his engine. He didn't think much of it. He'd just use his GPS to get back on track. As he stopped at a small intersection, blue and red lights suddenly flashed behind him. His heart gave a small jolt. At first he thought he must have missed a stop sign, or maybe his taillight was out. He pulled over to the side of the road and waited. 2 police officers stepped out of their car. Their flashlights cut through the dark, landing on his windshield. Daniel rolled down his window and kept his hands visible, just as everyone was taught to do. "Good evening, officers," he said politely. One of them didn't respond. The other asked for his license and registration, his tone firm but not yet hostile. Daniel handed them over and waited quietly. The first officer looked at his ID for a long moment, then at Daniel, then at the car. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Home," Daniel said. "Just got back from a work trip." "I think I took the wrong exit." The officer glanced at his partner. "Work trip, huh? What kind of work?" "I'm a systems analyst," Daniel replied. "I work with a defense agency on contract." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Defense, huh? And what brings you through here at this hour?" Daniel was confused. "Just driving home. I didn't realize this area was restricted." The second officer came back from the patrol car. "This car matches the description of one involved in a robbery earlier tonight," he said. "Dark sedan, out-of-state plates." Daniel blinked in disbelief. "Robbery? Officer, there must be some mistake, but they weren't listening." The first officer asked him to step out of the car. Daniel did as he was told. His hands were steady, though his chest felt tight. The cool night air brushed against his face as he stood under the flashing lights. "Do you have any weapons in the car?" "No, sir." "Do you mind if we check?" Daniel hesitated, but he knew refusing would only make things worse. "Go ahead," he said quietly. The officer searched his vehicle while the other kept a close eye on him. They found nothing, no stolen goods, no cash, no signs of a robbery. But instead of ending the stop, the officer's suspicion only seemed to grow. "Where did you say you were earlier tonight?" "I was in Arlington for meetings." "I can show you my schedule, emails, whatever you need." But before Daniel could reach for anything, the officer told him to keep his hands where they could see them. Minutes passed, then more. Cars occasionally drove by, their drivers slowing down to stare at the scene. To them, it probably looked like a routine arrest. To Daniel, it felt like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. After a while, the first officer came back. "Step to the back of the vehicle," he ordered. "Am I being detained?" Daniel asked calmly. "You're being questioned," the officer said. "We just need to clear a few things up." That few things turned into handcuffs. Cold metal locked around Daniel's wrists as he tried to speak. "Officer, this is a mistake. You can check my credentials. I work with the government. I can call someone who will verify." "Quiet," one of them said. "You can explain that downtown." Daniel didn't resist. He knew from experience that arguing would only make it worse. He watched as they finished searching his car, still finding nothing but a briefcase full of files, a laptop, and some clothes. They took his phone and placed it in an evidence bag. He was guided to the back of the police cruiser, the door shut behind him with a heavy click. As the car began to move, Daniel looked out through the small window at the passing houses. Lights were on in a few of them. Families were having dinner, kids were watching TV, people were living their normal lives. And here he was in handcuffs for something he didn't do. Inside the cruiser, the radio crackled with police chatter. The words were broken, but Daniel caught phrases like "suspect detained" and "vehicle secured." The two officers didn't speak to him during the ride. He sat in silence, his thoughts racing. He tried to think logically. Mistaken identity happened all the time. Once they checked his ID, they'd realize their error and let him go. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about their attitude was off, like they'd already decided who he was before hearing a word. The drive lasted about 20 minutes. When they arrived at the small police station, one of the officers pulled him out and led him through the side entrance. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. "Have a seat," one said, pushing him gently into a chair. Daniel sat quietly as they filled out paperwork. He could see a few other officers in the background, some glancing his way, whispering to each other. It was clear none of them knew what to make of him. He didn't look like a criminal. He was dressed neatly, polite, and spoke clearly. But sometimes suspicion needs no reason to grow. After nearly an hour, another officer came over with a folder. "You said you work with defense, right?" he asked. "Yes," Daniel replied. "I can give you contact information to verify that." The officer gave a skeptical look. "We'll see. In the meantime, you're being held for questioning." They took him into a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The light above was bright, buzzing faintly. One of the officers sat across from him. "Tell me again where you were between 7 and 9 tonight," the officer said. Daniel repeated everything. Where he had been, who he met, what route he took. He even mentioned the security checkpoints he passed through earlier that day. But the officer seemed uninterested, writing notes without looking up. After an hour of questioning, they left him alone in the room. Daniel stared at the blank wall, trying to stay calm. He thought about his family, who must be wondering why he hadn't called. He thought about his phone, now sitting somewhere in an evidence bag. And he thought about how easily things had spiraled. One wrong turn, one assumption, and suddenly his freedom was gone. He looked down at his hands, marked slightly red where the cuffs had been. He wasn't angry yet, just tired. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of being treated like a problem when all he had done was drive home. Minutes turned into an hour. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Daniel's eyes drifted toward the mirror on one side of the room. He knew there were people behind it watching. He also knew that in his briefcase sat documents that, if seen, would confirm his clearance level and identity beyond question. But they hadn't even looked at it properly. Eventually, the door opened again. A different officer entered, older, more experienced looking. "Mr. Reed," he said, glancing at the file in his hand. "You say you're working on federal defense contracts?" "Yes," Daniel answered. The man nodded slowly. "Well, until we confirm that, you'll need to remain here. Protocol, you understand?" Daniel almost smiled at the word protocol. It was one he heard often in his own work, usually before something went wrong. When the officer left, Daniel took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't panic. There was one number he could call that would end this entire misunderstanding in minutes. But first he needed access to a phone. They hadn't allowed it yet. As the night stretched on, the quiet of the small town station felt heavier. Somewhere in the distance, a police scanner murmured. Outside, the wind picked up. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He told himself that soon they would realize their mistake. Someone would make a call, check his background, and everything would be cleared up. He just had to stay patient. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The officers hadn't treated him like someone they thought might be innocent. They had treated him like someone they wanted to catch. And for the first time that night, a thought crossed his mind. What if no one checked? What if they didn't believe him at all? That thought sat with him in the silence, heavier than the cuffs had been. He closed his eyes, trying to push it away. But the unease stayed, whispering quietly in the back of his mind. He didn't know it yet, but that one call he was about to make, the one they were ignoring, would soon reach far beyond that small town. It would travel across states into secure offices, through corridors guarded by armed personnel. It would reach the Pentagon itself, and when it did, everything about that night would change. The small room felt colder than before. Daniel sat still, listening to the faint sound of footsteps outside. Every few minutes, a door opened or closed somewhere down the hallway, followed by the sound of a phone ringing. The fluorescent light above him flickered slightly, adding to the uneasiness that had already filled the air. He had been sitting there for hours. His watch had been taken, so he wasn't sure of the time, but his body told him it was late, well past midnight. The fatigue from his long day was starting to catch up with him, but his mind was wide awake. When the door opened again, a younger officer entered, carrying a folder and a cup of coffee. He set the coffee on the table, but it wasn't for Daniel. "You've been here a while," the officer said, almost casually. "You want to tell me again what exactly you do for work?" Daniel looked up, trying to stay calm. "I work in systems analysis," he said patiently. "My company provides consulting for defense communication networks. We manage secure systems, test data transfers, that sort of thing. I was in Arlington for a meeting with one of the project leads." The officer leaned against the wall. "That sounds fancy," he said. "You got proof of all that?" "Yes," Daniel said. "My credentials are in my briefcase. There are documents with my clearance ID inside. You can check the government-issued number on the badge." The officer didn't move to check. "We'll get to that," he said, flipping open the folder. "Thing is, your car was spotted near a robbery site about 40 minutes before you were stopped. Same model, same color. You can understand why that looks suspicious." Daniel took a slow breath. "I understand, but I wasn't anywhere near that place. You can track my phone's location or check the toll cameras. I drove straight through the highway." The officer nodded, writing something in his notebook, though his expression didn't show whether he believed any of it. After a pause, he said, "Mind if I ask, why is a defense contractor driving through a small town like this in the middle of the night?" "Because I took the wrong exit," Daniel replied quietly. "I missed the highway turn. That's all." The officer tapped his pen against the table. "And you're saying you have no connection to the robbery, no reason to be near that area, and you just happened to end up here by accident?" "Yes," Daniel said firmly. "I'm telling you the truth." The officer sighed, closed the folder, and said, "All right, Mr. Reed. We'll see what comes up when we run your information. Till then, just sit tight." He left the room, leaving the cup of coffee untouched on the table. Daniel leaned forward, resting his hands together. He wasn't angry yet, just puzzled by how easily this had spiraled out of control. He had worked for years in an environment where mistakes were costly, where every decision was based on evidence, not guesswork. But here, evidence didn't seem to matter. He had told them the truth, offered documents, offered verification. Yet no one seemed interested in checking. It was as if they'd made up their minds before he had said a word. After another long stretch of silence, the door opened again. This time, 2 officers came in. One of them was older, maybe the same one who'd spoken to him earlier at the scene. He had the kind of expression that said he'd seen everything and didn't have patience for anything new. "Mr. Reed," the older one began, "we checked your car and your belongings. You have a lot of documents in that briefcase. Some look technical. Care to explain what they're about?" "They're project files," Daniel said. "Mostly encrypted systems, data, and reports. Nothing classified beyond what I'm cleared to carry." The officer frowned. "Encrypted, huh? So we can't see what's inside?" "That's right," Daniel said. "Only authorized personnel can open them. But if you call the contact on my federal badge, they'll confirm everything." The older officer stared at him for a long moment. "We'll look into that. But until we confirm, you'll stay here." Daniel felt a small spark of frustration rise in him. "With respect, sir, I haven't done anything wrong. You've checked my car, my ID, my records. You haven't found anything because there's nothing to find." The officer crossed his arms. "That's not for you to decide." For a moment, neither spoke. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Then the officer turned and left, leaving the door slightly ajar. Through the narrow opening, Daniel could see a hallway with a few desks and a vending machine. A clock hung on the wall showing it was past 1 in the morning. He leaned back, his mind spinning. He didn't want to get angry, it never helped, but the situation was starting to feel absurd. He thought about the irony. He had clearance to walk into high-security buildings, yet here he was, being held in a small-town station like a suspect in a petty crime. An hour later, a different officer entered the room, holding Daniel's phone in his hand. "We went through your contacts," the man said. "You've got a lot of government numbers here. Some restricted. Care to explain why that is?" Daniel looked at the phone and then at the officer. "Because it's part of my job," he said simply. "Those numbers are my work contacts. You really shouldn't be going through them." The officer shrugged. "We're just doing our job, too." Daniel shook his head slightly. "No, you're not. If you were, you'd have already made one call. to the verification line listed on the back of my ID. That one call would tell you everything you need to know. The officer narrowed his eyes. And who exactly would answer that call? The Department of Defense, Daniel said calmly. Or someone from their communication security branch. The officer blinked as if unsure whether to believe him. He left without saying another word. The room fell quiet again. Daniel looked around and realized he could hear a faint ticking sound somewhere, maybe from the vent. His patience was wearing thin. He wasn't used to being powerless. In his field, everything had procedure. If a system failed, you followed a plan to fix it. But here there was no plan. Just people deciding what they wanted to believe. Time kept slipping by. He started thinking about what would happen if this went on until morning. His colleagues would start wondering why he hadn't checked in. His family might file a missing person report, and all because 2 local officers didn't want to make a phone call. Finally, around what felt like 2 or 3 in the morning, the older officer came back. "Mr. Reed," he said, "we're still waiting on verification. Until we have it, you'll stay here for observation." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Can I at least make a call?" The officer hesitated, then said, "1 call. That's it." They escorted him to another small desk in the corner of the station. A single black landline phone sat there. Daniel sat down, and for the first time that night he felt a small sense of control return. He picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory, a number he had used only a handful of times in his life. The line rang once, then a calm, steady voice answered. "This is operations," the voice said. "This is Daniel Reed," he replied. "Clearance code Delta 974. I've been detained by local authorities in Brookvale County. I need immediate verification through Defense Communications." There was silence for a brief second, followed by a firm response. "Stand by." The officer standing behind Daniel looked confused. "Who are you calling exactly?" Daniel didn't answer. He just held the phone, his eyes fixed straight ahead. A few moments later, the voice returned. "Mr. Reed, your clearance and identity are confirmed. Please stay where you are. Do not engage further. We'll handle it." The line went dead. Daniel placed the phone back slowly. The officer watching him frowned. "What was that?" "Just verification," Daniel said quietly. "You'll know soon." He was taken back to the small room. This time the officers didn't seem as sure of themselves. They whispered among each other, checking their radios more often. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. Through the thin walls, Daniel could hear phones ringing, one after another. A tense voice somewhere said, "The chief needs to take this call now." Another voice said, "They're on the line from D.C." Daniel stayed seated, expression calm, but inside he felt the relief of knowing the truth was finally catching up. He had done nothing wrong, and soon they would have no choice but to see it. Minutes passed, then a loud knock echoed from outside the interrogation room. The door opened and one of the younger officers stepped in, his face pale. Mr. Reed, the chief will be here shortly," he said quietly. "Seems there's been a development." Daniel nodded once. "I figured there might be." The officer swallowed hard as if unsure what to say next, then left. Daniel leaned back in the chair. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Somewhere out there, calls were being made. Questions were being answered. And people in high offices were realizing that a man they worked with, a man who had clearance to handle national systems, had been sitting handcuffed in a small-town police station for hours. He didn't feel anger anymore, just exhaustion. All he wanted now was to go home. But as he sat there in silence, he knew something had changed. Not just for him, but for the people who had put him there. They were about to learn a lesson that would echo far beyond that little station. And the night, which had started so ordinary, was now about to take a turn that none of them could have predicted. Daniel sat alone in the small room again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the same heavy, uncertain quiet that had followed him all night. Now there was movement outside, quick footsteps, short whispers, phones ringing more than usual. Something was clearly happening. He could feel the shift in energy without even seeing it. The officers who had been so confident before were now unsettled. The sound of hurried voices carried through the thin walls, and though he couldn't hear every word, he caught fragments like D.C., confirmation, and the Pentagon. Daniel stayed calm. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He just sat quietly, hands resting on the table, waiting. He had no interest in revenge or making a scene. He only wanted this mistake to end. After what felt like half an hour, the door opened and one of the younger officers stepped in. His posture was noticeably different now. The firmness in his voice had disappeared. "Mr. Reed," he said, not meeting Daniel's eyes. "The chief will be here shortly. We've been told to—" "Hold off on any further questioning." Daniel simply nodded. "Understood." The young officer gave a nervous half-smile before slipping back out. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the clock. The ticking was louder than before, or maybe he was just more aware of it now. Every second that passed reminded him how long he'd been here, how easily his life had been put on pause by a single assumption. He closed his eyes for a moment. Memories of the evening replayed in his head like scenes in slow motion. The flashing lights, the handcuffs, the cold metal chair, the suspicion in the officer's eyes. It was strange how quickly a person's dignity could be questioned. Then, after another long stretch of waiting, the door opened again, and this time, the man who walked in was someone different. He wore a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves and carried a phone in one hand. His expression was serious, his tone quiet but sharp. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I'm Chief Owens." Daniel nodded slightly. "Chief." Owens looked him over for a second, then placed the phone on the table. "We've had some calls tonight. Very important ones." Daniel said nothing. "I just got off a call with Washington," the chief continued. "Apparently you're not only a contractor, but you're involved in ongoing national defense operations. High clearance level. That correct?" "Yes," Daniel said simply. The chief nodded slowly, as if each word he'd heard from D.C. was still settling in. "I see. Well, Mr. Reed, it looks like there's been a very unfortunate misunderstanding here." Daniel stayed silent for a moment. "I told your officers that hours ago," he said calmly. "I know," the chief admitted. He pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "I'm not going to make excuses. You were detained under the assumption that your vehicle matched a robbery suspect's car, but after a full review, it's clear that was incorrect. The suspect's car wasn't even the same model year. I take full responsibility for the mix-up." Daniel studied him quietly. The chief's voice wasn't defensive. If anything, it sounded tired. "I'll have your belongings returned immediately," the chief said. "And your car is being released. I can only imagine what this must have been like for you." Daniel took a slow breath before answering. "Chief, I understand mistakes happen, but this went beyond a mix-up. I was handcuffed, questioned, and treated like a criminal without anyone verifying basic facts. That's not procedure. That's assumption." The chief looked down at the table, clearly uneasy. "You're right," he said after a pause. "And I can't undo what's already been done. But I want you to know, and this is not something we take lightly. Washington made that clear to us too." That last sentence hung in the air for a moment. Daniel nodded. "What did they say?" The chief sighed. "They weren't exactly happy. Let's just say we're going to be reviewing our entire identification protocol after tonight." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The chief's expression said everything. This wasn't just a local issue anymore. Higher offices were already involved. A few minutes later, another officer entered, carrying Daniel's briefcase, phone, and ID. He placed them gently on the table, almost as if afraid to touch them too roughly. "Here you go, sir," he said quietly. Daniel stood up and checked his belongings. Everything seemed to be in order. He slipped his badge back into his wallet and his phone into his pocket. As he prepared to leave, the chief extended a hand. "Again, I'm deeply sorry for what happened. If there's anything we can do—" Daniel looked at the hand, then shook it slowly. "Just remember, Chief," he said in a calm, steady voice. "Respect isn't something people earn by rank or title. It starts with how you treat someone who has nothing to prove." The chief's jaw tightened slightly. "Understood." Daniel gave a short nod, then walked toward the door. The hallway outside was quiet again. The same officers who had questioned him earlier were standing near the desks, pretending to work, but watching him as he passed. None of them spoke. A few looked embarrassed. Outside, the air was cool and still. The flashing lights were gone. His car sat parked near the side entrance, cleaned out and unlocked. He opened the door, sat behind the wheel, and took a deep breath before starting the engine. The dashboard clock read 3:42 a.m. As he drove away, the small town disappeared in his rearview mirror. Streetlights blurred softly against the glass as his car picked up speed. The roads were empty, but his thoughts were not. He thought about the irony of the night. How a man who worked to protect secure systems could be treated like a threat over a license plate match. How truth had to travel through half the country just to be heard in a small room. When he stopped at the next gas station to refuel, the attendant gave him a friendly nod. "Late night?" he asked. "Yeah," Daniel said with a faint smile. "Longer than expected." He paid for the gas, grabbed a bottle of water, and stood by his car for a moment looking up at the stars. The night sky stretched endlessly above him, quiet and clear. It was strange how peaceful it all looked after such chaos. He got back into the car and checked his phone. There were several missed calls and messages from colleagues asking if he had made it home safely. He typed a short reply, "All good now. Rough night. We'll explain later." As the car rolled back onto the highway, he turned the radio on. The low sound of distant jazz filled the silence, helping him breathe easier. Still, a thought stayed in the back of his mind. If he hadn't made that call, what would have happened? Would anyone have believed him? Or would he still be sitting in that cold room, waiting for someone to care enough to check? The truth was, most people would never get that chance. Not everyone had a number they could call that reached that far up the chain. By the time the first light of dawn began to appear, Daniel finally felt a bit of the tension leave his shoulders. The sky was turning pale blue, the highway ahead stretching wide and empty. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal again, but then his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number from Washington. He hesitated for a second, then answered. "Mr. Reed," a calm voice said on the other end. "This is Major Grant with Defense Operations. We were informed of what happened tonight. Are you safe?" "Yes," Daniel said. "I'm fine now." "Good, we've already spoken with local authorities. There will be a full review. You don't need to worry about anything." "I appreciate that," Daniel said quietly. There was a short pause. Then the voice added, "I want to thank you for how you handled it. Not everyone would have kept calm in that situation. It speaks a lot to your character." Daniel gave a small, tired laugh. "Calm was the only thing I had left." "I understand," the voice said. "Try to get some rest. We'll be in touch later today." The call ended and Daniel slipped the phone back into the seat beside him. The sun was slowly rising now, painting the road ahead in gold. For the first time all night, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The confusion, the fear, the frustration, it all came rushing back in waves. But beneath it all was something stronger, relief. He was free. It was over. Yet he knew the story wouldn't end there. Something about what happened would echo long after this night. The people who detained him would remember. The calls made from the Pentagon would be recorded and discussed. And maybe, just maybe, this mistake would lead to something better. A small change in how people were treated when all they had done was take a wrong turn. Daniel took one last deep breath and focused on the road ahead. The sun climbed higher, lighting the horizon. He didn't know what the next day would bring. But one thing was certain. This night, strange as it was, had changed more than just his own story. It had reminded everyone who was listening that truth, no matter how delayed, always finds its way. The next hour inside that small-town police station felt like a quiet storm building behind closed doors. The officers who had once acted so confidently now looked uneasy, whispering to each other near the front desk. The station, which had been loud with chatter just an hour earlier, had gone almost silent. Phones rang more often, but every time they did, the person who answered seemed to pale a little more. Inside the interrogation room, Daniel sat quietly. His wrists still felt the tightness from the cuffs, though they had been removed earlier. A half-empty paper cup sat in front of him on the metal table. He hadn't touched it. He was thinking about how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Just a few hours ago, he had been driving home minding his own business. Now he was sitting in a police station, treated like a suspect. He wasn't angry anymore, not exactly. He was more disappointed. It was the same kind of disappointment a teacher feels when a bright student makes a careless mistake. He had tried to stay calm from the beginning, to explain who he was and where he was coming from. But they never listened, and now they were realizing what that mistake might cost them. The door opened suddenly. The same officer who had arrested him earlier stepped inside, his voice quieter now. "Sir," he said awkwardly. The chief wants to speak with you. Daniel looked up slowly. Finally, he said softly, standing up. As he walked through the narrow hallway, he noticed how different the mood was. The officers who had once looked at him with suspicion were now avoiding his eyes. Some pretended to be busy typing, others walked away as he passed. Something had clearly changed, and Daniel didn't yet know the full extent of it. When he entered the chief's office, the first thing he noticed was the man behind the desk, holding a phone to his ear. The chief's face was pale, his tone respectful, almost fearful. He was nodding repeatedly, saying, "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." Then he glanced at Daniel and quickly ended the call. "Mr. Reed," the chief began, his voice shaky. "It appears there's been a misunderstanding." Daniel stayed quiet for a moment. The chief gestured for him to sit, but he remained standing. "I see," Daniel said calmly. "A misunderstanding that involved being handcuffed on the street and locked in here for 3 hours?" The chief swallowed hard. "I understand how that must feel. Believe me, this was never our intention. But we just got off the phone with—" He hesitated. "With someone from the Department of Defense. They've confirmed your credentials. And, well, we didn't realize you were working on national security matters." Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. "You shouldn't have to know who I work for to treat me with basic respect." That sentence seemed to hit harder than anything else. The chief sighed, running a hand over his face. "You're right. Completely right. I take full responsibility for what happened. The officers acted on incomplete information." "Incomplete?" Daniel repeated, his tone quiet but firm. "You stopped me because my car looked like another one. You ignored my ID, my explanation, and my request to call a lawyer. That's not incomplete information. That's a choice." The chief lowered his head. "You have every right to be upset. I can only apologize on behalf of the department. I'll be filing an internal report," and before he could finish, the phone on his desk rang again. He picked it up, listened for a moment, and immediately straightened up. "Yes, sir. Yes, he's right here," he said quickly, then handed the phone to Daniel. "Mr. Reed, it's for you." Daniel took the phone slowly. The voice on the other end was calm and commanding, the same Pentagon official he had spoken with earlier. "Daniel, we've handled it," the voice said. "You're clear to leave immediately. Transportation has been arranged if you need it. The state office has been notified of the situation, and we're making sure this doesn't happen again." "Thank you," Daniel replied. "I'll handle it from here." Before hanging up, the voice added quietly, "You did the right thing staying calm. That's what made this easier to fix." When Daniel handed the phone back, the chief looked nervous. "Would you like an escort back to your car?" he asked. "No," Daniel said simply. "I'd just like my belongings back." They walked together to the evidence desk. His briefcase and phone were waiting there. When Daniel picked up his phone, he noticed that one of the officers had been holding it earlier, probably curious about its contents. The same officer now looked away, red-faced. Daniel signed the release form, then turned toward the door. But before leaving, he paused and faced the chief again. "You know," he said, "I've spent years working on systems meant to protect people, even people who'll never know my name. Tonight I was treated like someone who didn't matter. Maybe next time you stop someone, just remember, everyone matters to someone." The chief nodded slowly, clearly humbled. "You're right, Mr. Reed, I'll remember that." Daniel walked out of the station into the cool night air. The sky was dark and quiet now, the town empty except for the hum of streetlights. His car was still parked outside, a few spots away from where he'd been stopped. He opened the door and sat inside for a moment, just breathing. He thought about how easily things could have gone worse. If he'd gotten angry, if he'd resisted, if he hadn't remembered that number to call. So many people didn't have that kind of help. That realization sat heavy with him. Before driving off, he looked in the rearview mirror. Through the glass doors of the station, he could see the chief standing inside, watching him leave. It wasn't anger Daniel felt, and it was something else. Maybe sadness, or maybe just clarity. The drive back was quiet. The highway stretched ahead, lined with faint orange lights. He rolled down the window slightly, letting the cold wind brush against his face. Every few miles his phone buzzed with notifications, messages from his colleagues, from officials confirming that everything had been cleared. But he ignored them for now. He just wanted peace. By the time he reached his hotel, it was past midnight. He parked, walked inside, and went straight to his room. The weight of the night finally hit him as he sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his reflection in the window. Tired but composed, he thought about the officers. He thought about the look on the young one's face when the chief came in, the sudden fear, the realization that they'd gone too far. He didn't hate them. He just wished they'd listened. As he poured himself a glass of water, his phone rang again. It was the Pentagon official. "I wanted to check that you're all right," the voice said. "I'm fine," Daniel replied. "But I can't stop thinking, what if it had been someone else? Someone without clearance or a number to call?" There was silence on the other end. Then the voice said quietly, "You're right. Not everyone gets that chance. But maybe your story will help change how some people think." "Maybe," Daniel said softly. "I hope so." After the call ended, he sat there for a long time. The city outside was silent, but his mind was full. He opened his laptop and began typing notes. Not about the incident itself, but about what it revealed. About power, fear, and the way assumptions shape actions. He wasn't sure what he'd do with it yet, but he knew the story wasn't over. He looked at the time, 2:03 a.m., and finally decided to rest. As he turned off the lights, the memory of the police chief's face came back to him. That look of regret, of realization. Daniel didn't want revenge or attention. What he wanted was change. Quiet, lasting change. Somewhere far away in a dimly lit office in Washington, that same Pentagon official was still making calls. Policies were being reviewed. Questions were being asked. What happened in that small station had already started ripples much larger than anyone there could imagine. And as Daniel finally closed his eyes, one thought stayed with him. Sometimes justice doesn't come from anger. Sometimes it starts with patience, truth, and the courage to stay calm when everything around you feels unfair. He didn't know it yet, but the world would soon hear about what happened that night, and the lessons from it would travel far beyond that quiet town. The next morning came with soft sunlight peeking through the hotel window. Daniel woke up to a calm silence that felt almost unreal after everything that had happened the night before. For a few seconds, he just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to process how much had changed in less than 24 hours. His phone buzzed again, this time with messages from colleagues and unknown numbers. Reporters were already trying to reach him. Somehow the story had started spreading. Someone inside the police department must have talked. But Daniel wasn't interested in giving interviews or explaining himself to cameras. He didn't want attention. He wanted understanding. He got up slowly, made some coffee, and looked out the window at the busy street below. People were walking to work. Cars moved along quietly, and the world seemed completely normal again. Yet inside, he felt a quiet storm still brewing. By noon, he had packed his bag and checked out of the hotel. Before leaving town, he stopped by a small diner for lunch. The waitress smiled politely as she poured his coffee, not recognizing him, and that was exactly how he liked it. He just wanted to feel normal again. Halfway through his meal, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but he answered anyway. "Mr. Reed," the voice said carefully. "This is Officer Daniels from the State Investigation Unit. We've been directed to conduct an internal review of what happened last night. The Pentagon's office reached out to us this morning." Daniel nodded, even though the man couldn't see him. "I expected that might happen. I just wanted to inform you that we're taking this very seriously. I can't say much, but I wanted to personally apologize for the treatment you received. The officers involved are already being questioned." Daniel paused. He didn't want revenge or punishment. That wasn't what this was about. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate the call. I just hope it leads to better training and better judgment in the future." "It will," the man replied quietly. "I promise you that." When the call ended, Daniel sat for a long moment staring at his coffee. The weight of those words, better judgment, stuck with him. That was all he had wanted from the beginning. After lunch, he began the long drive home. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, lined with fields and patches of forest. The hum of the tires against the road was steady and soothing. With every passing mile, the memory of the flashing lights in the cold interrogation room began to fade, but it wasn't gone. Some moments stay with you, not because you want them to, but because they teach you something you'll never forget. As he drove, Daniel thought about his late father, who had served in the military years ago. He used to say, "Respect is free to give but expensive to lose." Now those words made more sense than ever.